Hey everybody, join me as I take a deep dive into another Stephen King classic. In this segment I call SK Reviews. Warning, there will be spoilers ahead. Hey everybody, in this video I'm going to begin my 3-video series where I discuss and ultimately rate Stephen King's, arguably his magnum opus, the complete and uncut version of The Stand, which was released in 1990. This is my personal copy, my Barnes & Noble bargain special. It's pretty nice. I like the looks of it. But anyway, it is also Stephen King's longest book. This is something that everybody knows. And it is divided into 3 books. Book 1 is Captain Trips, Book 2, On the Border, and Book 3, The Stand. So in this video, I'm going to specifically be talking about Captain Trips. In the next video, Book 2, and then in the third and final video, I will talk about Book 3, The Stand, and then give some final thoughts and some wrapping up. The book is so long, I didn't want to create one video that would likely be over an hour long. I thought I would break it up to make it more timely for me because I have a tendency to go through books pretty slowly. I didn't want to take a month or a month and a half to read this book or listen to it and then have kind of forgotten some of my feelings from early on in the listening process. So that's what's going to happen in this video. I'm going to be talking about Book 1 of The Stand, Captain Trips. So the first time I read The Stand, I was in college. This was well over 20 years ago, and it took me a long time to read it. I want to say 2 or 3 months to read the book. I've always been kind of a slow reader, and while I have intended or wished or thought I should reread that one at some point, just the sheer length, as it always has been in my life, the sheer length of the book is daunting, and there's always other things that are shorter, quicker, and easier to read or listen to that I always end up getting bumped to the top of my list. But the Stephen King book club that I am part of here in Oklahoma is reading The Stand for their September meeting. So what better excuse, what better reason than to take this epic journey once again? And honestly, it's a bit daunting to even think about reviewing or ultimately rating or assigning a score to The Stand. It is arguably, aside from maybe It or The Shining, it is most likely Stephen King's most famous work of his entire long career. The Stand is head and shoulders. In terms of recognition and pop culture impact, The Stand is huge. It's so huge that it's hard really to view it objectively. But honestly, it's big and it's great and it's sprawling, but it's not perfect. So my goal when revisiting The Stand was to try to think critically and put my black hat on and just my critical lens and really take some notes and kind of get down in the weeds with it, but then pull back and, try to see the big picture impact, see the forest, and not get so hung up on the trees. So I'm going to try to have it both ways in this video series. I remember in college, the first time I read the book, really enjoying it, like just being impressed and blown away by it. And it was my professed favorite Stephen King book for many years. And that's another reason that I was really curious and excited to get back and revisit it to see if it would hold up all these years later. I did attempt a few years ago to read the 1978 cut of The Stand, and ultimately just kind of ran out of steam with it. It seemed kind of pointless after having my first experience be with the complete and uncut, which I really enjoyed. There was nothing about it where I was like, God, there's so much dead weight on this book. I wish there was a shorter, more to the point version of this story. So I got about halfway through the 1978 cut, and honestly, it just kind of felt like a Reader's Digest condensed version of the novel. And I moved on to other things. I didn't honestly finish it because I didn't quite see the point. But it is out there, and it is a really, really interesting compare and contrast between the two if you are so inclined. So I hardly need to do a plot summary of The Stand, especially for the viewers of this channel. But basically what happens in book 1 is that a government-designed super flu virus accidentally escapes the lab where it is being created under highly controlled conditions, and it infects a soldier. This all happens within like the first 20 pages of the book. Infects a soldier who manages to get off the base before everything is locked down, grabs his family, and they hightail it east from California, and they get as far as Texas before the virus ultimately takes their lives. And as soon as they encounter other people, the virus begins to spread and spread and spread. And it just so happens that this particular strain of virus has a 99.4% rate of transmissibility. So 994 out of every 1,000 people who catch this will basically die from it. It's incredibly vicious, incredibly potent. And for the 6 of every 1,000 people who don't die, they're left picking up the pieces and trying to figure out what comes next. Some are overwhelmed by just the emotion of the loss. Basically, everybody lost every single person that they knew and cared about, and some of them commit suicide, and others who survive the initial wave of the virus then end up stumbling and dying in just really random ways, because with the entirety of society broken down, there's no doctor. If you get an infection, there is medicine, but you have to be able to get to the medicine and like break into the pharmacy and steal the medicine, which people do because there's nobody left to stop them. So basically, book 1 begins with this single point, this single man who makes a decision, a fateful decision, that ends up basically destroying the vast majority of the entire population of Earth. And so in book 1, society kind of flares up and people become aware of the sickness that's going around. We get to see how the media reacts, how the government reacts, the information and the misinformation that is shared to try to keep the population docile and under control, ultimately for nothing. And everything starts to kind of, it gets really, really big. It mushrooms up in terms of the scope of the chaos and the madness that's going on. And then as everyone starts dying, it kind of crystallizes and streamlines down to the main few characters that we've been following all along, as they're kind of making their way, wandering around, and trying to figure out what comes next. So that's, in a nutshell, the plot summary of book 1 of The Stand. So what works in book 1 of The Stand? One of the things that I remember taking away from my first read of the book over 20 years ago, and the thing that I would tell people about it, was that, well, at least to me, it was the biggest story, like the biggest idea for a novel that I had ever read. And it was as long as it needed to be to do justice to this huge idea. And that is still one of my big takeaways, especially in the beginning, as Stephen King is juggling multiple storylines. The details are almost overwhelming. And it gets scarier and more intense the more everything that we know and take for granted starts to break down. When the local doctor starts sneezing, then you know, oh my God, he's not going to be long for this world. When the president is on TV and coughs into his hand a couple of times while addressing the nation, there you go. He's also not long for this world. The scope and the scale and the detail is just huge. It's almost overwhelming. But then, like I said, once it reaches that crescendo of madness, then it really quickly kind of narrows down into a point of focus, which really helps to clarify the novel and the main players and what comes next. So we follow multiple main characters in multiple storylines. And that's all really interesting. And it provides sort of an intimate view of the impact of what's going on to regular people's lives. And all of these people, I think there's added weight to all of their stories because they're all in the midst of some type of huge life situation. So like Fran just has found out that she's pregnant, and she tells the father, and she has this big dust up with her family, and then she also ends up facing the end of the world. Larry just hit it big, and he's got a song on the Hot 100, and it's working its way up the charts, and he then gets to face the end of the world when none of that matters. In fact, the things that we value, that we take so importantly, like songs working their way up the Hot 100, are almost comically irrelevant in the face of Captain Trips. But yeah, the vignettes. So we have our main characters, and including government officials. There's some really well fleshed out government officials, and we find out the impact that this is having on them, as well as our main characters. But then interspersed throughout book one, there are these vignettes, these little like thumbnail sketches of regular people dealing with this unimaginable crisis. Most of these scenes are modest and humble, but still powerful. Little micro portraits of what regular people do in times of crisis. Other vignettes, take a much broader picture and give you a sense of the madness and the chaos and just the absolute insanity that's going on across the world, as well as in particular the government and the military's desperate lengths that they're going to try to contain the story, to try to contain the information, as they were not able to contain the virus, for whatever it's worth. You know, radio DJs who like barricade themselves into their studios and just go live and unfiltered and want to tell the truth. And then the military showing up to kill them and to end their broadcast and to destroy their satellites. You can't help it when you're listening to it or reading it. Like, what the heck is the point? This is really happening. Everybody knows that there's something really, really serious going on. So Stephen King does a great job, I think, of pulling back and showing these like bigger skyscraper views of the madness going on, and then really zeroing in on individuals and small experiences and small lives to give both the macro and the micro view of the absolute devastation going on in the world of The Stand. So I've said it before that there's almost like an inverse proportion. Like Stephen King, at the beginning of his career, the inspiration was hot and heavy, and he just like one thing after another was just another iconic peak of the modern horror genre. So while his ideas and his inspiration were just off the charts, his writing was raw. And over time, as the inspiration and the fire arguably have gotten less, his writing has gotten more polished. Until by this point, I feel like as a writer, he's at the pinnacle of his entire career, which makes total sense. He's been honing his craft for decades at this point. Hundreds of thousands of hours spent writing and refining and honing his craft. So while the inspiration isn't always there, in my opinion, he's had some kind of blah books over the last 10 years. The writing has never been better. But conversely, in his earlier books, the writing can be sometimes a little clumsy or a little over-reliant on things like adverbs. And while The Stand is a huge legendary novel, it is one that represents the earlier part of Stephen King's now very, very long career. And it is chock full of adverbs. If it was a candy bar, it would be called chock full of adverbs. One really amusing instance that I wrote down was that there's a bald man, and he's outside and he's in the sun, and it says that the bald man's head gleamed benignly. His head gleamed benignly. What in the world does that even mean? How can a gleam off of a bald man's head be benign? doesn't mean like it was noticeable, but it wasn't painful to look at. It wasn't so gleaming that it like hurt people's eyes. It just kind of had kind of like a subdued sheen to it. I don't know. And I know that this might be kind of a controversial opinion, but one of the things that it both works and it doesn't work, and that it could be better, is the nature of the plague itself. So it's subtle and it's insidious, and it just slowly and inexorably works its way into society and across the entirety of the world. People catch it. Ultimately, initially, it seems like the flu or a cold, and then the flu, and then it gets worse and worse over a period of days or sometimes just several hours, and then the person ends up dying. So all around the main characters, the world, the people in the world are just kind of slowly fading away, and they're dying. And the world itself, the houses, the buildings, nature, everything is in perfect order. It's all just sitting there, as one character says in the first book, waiting for someone to come and pick it up again. And the first book in The Stand has a lot of, I mean, truly horrific elements. There's even some humorous elements. There's a bit of romance, but it's just really, really ultimately sad. Society ends with a whimper and not with a bang. It's hard to really make exciting somebody getting the flu and then getting sicker and sicker and laying down in their bed and just passing away. So while it almost seems like blasphemy to say so, because I know the huge regard that the novel has for Stephen King fans and even people who don't normally read Stephen King but have maybe read The Stand, I almost feel like the quiet, just insidious way that the plague works in the background and kind of just slowly and efficiently like fades everyone in the world to gray is almost like a fatal flaw in the very architecture, the very underpinning of the entire novel. Of course, Stephen King's ultimate goal was to do that, to burn off most of the populace so that he can get this like microcosm, good versus evil, and find out what happens with these people who are left in this situation. And he definitely gets there, and that will be the next 800 pages of the novel that I have yet to read. But across the first 400 pages, like I said, it's more sad than scary, and there were parts of the first 400 pages where it just kind of, it seemed like it was taking a long time to get to where Stephen King needed to go, which is not a positive thing. But on the other hand, like I said earlier, and like I still truly believe, I mean, talk about Orwellian, I'm of two separate minds at the same time about this. So while the plague is almost too subtle for its own good, and it's more sad than scary, like I said earlier, the novel is as big as it needs to be to see this huge idea through to fruition. And that's what I mean by a strength and also a weakness. One of the classic indispensable elements, but also potentially a fatal flaw.
And now a word about our sponsor.
For over 20 years, StephenKingCollector.com has been the internet's go-to source for all things Stephen King. From breaking news and real-time sales updates from around the internet, to forums where you can connect with like-minded collectors, to information about first editions as well as highly sought-after and rare limited editions, StephenKingCollector.com has it all. Additionally, the collector sells custom slipcases to protect your most valuable and cherished treasures. The collector now offers book sales directly through the website and an all-around upgraded and improved payment system. With improvements and updates happening on a regular basis, there's always something new to see and experience at StephenKingCollector.com. The link to the site is in the description for this video. You should go check it out. You'll be glad you did. So there are a few really standout classic scenes in book one of The Stand. The first one of those is the scene where Fran tells her mother about her pregnancy. It's absolutely devastating totally predictable based on what we know about the characters up to that point, but just harrowing and devastating and upsetting and sad, and just written with such pain and vitriol. I mean, it's characterizations and these types of dialogue heavy confrontations between the characters. That is like Stephen King's bread and butter. And the scene where Fran talks to her mother and tells her about her pregnancy is absolutely devastating, especially when you know in the back of your mind that all of it is going to be completely and utterly irrelevant. You know, if Fran had told her mother, "Hey Ma, I'm pregnant," and her mother had known that like she only had days to live, that the whole world was going to end, would she have reacted the same way? You know, I would like to think that if I knew I only had a few days left to live, it would make me really treasure and like really, really be there and be present and supportive for everyone in my life. Of course, on the other hand, it may inspire me to rob a bank or a convenience store and just Thelma and Louise it into the Grand Canyon. I don't know. And as much as the government and the military are not sympathetic figures in The Stand, I really admired the way that Stephen King turned Starkey, who is the commander of the base where the virus was initially being developed and initially leaked from, really makes Starkey into a sympathetic figure. And once Starkey realizes that he's been relieved of his command, he has been like he can't look away from this camera feed that keeps showing the lab itself and the scientists in the lab who have all passed away. And in particular, a scientist who seemingly just like keeled over while he was eating soup, and his face fell into the bowl of soup. And Starkey just keeps looking at this man's face submerged in a bowl of soup. And once Starkey realizes that it's all over, it's all lost, he actually goes down to the lab and he goes in and he's looking everything over. And it, like I said, it's not scary so much as sad. And he pulls the man's face out of the bowl of soup. And there's just something about that gesture and about Starkey basically just giving up and completely admitting defeat and choosing to spend his last moments sort of paying tribute to and honoring the doctors, the scientists, and the soldiers who basically gave their lives because of a freak accident. And it's not ultimately, like, big picture view, it's not sympathetic at all, because the military was 100% lying to the American people and shouldn't have been developing this germ warfare agent in the first place. But they were, and the actual cost of that were real everyday people's lives. The main villain in The Stand, as we all know, is Randall Flagg. And in the chapter where Flagg is first introduced, it's very reminiscent of the original The Dark Man poem that Stephen King wrote in college and which was later illustrated and released by Cemetery Dance. It's full of these jagged little bursts of poetry, and I really liked, Stephen King, obviously the idea of this character has been with him for a long time, since he was a very young man. And the poem, while not directly copied, the poem, the style of the poem, the jagged little like vivid images obviously lived on to inspire this chapter in The Stand, and I really appreciated that. The Stand also includes one of the all-time, like probably top 3 scariest Stephen King scenes in any Stephen King novel. And that is, of course, the scene of Larry escaping Manhattan by going through the Lincoln Tunnel. And the power's out, so the tunnel is pitch black, and he forgot to bring a flashlight, and just Larry's growing sense of unease and paranoia and fear, it's palpable. I have actually read or listened to that scene probably half a dozen times in my life, and it always gives me like a palpable, creepy, like my blood pressure goes up, my heart starts racing, I get sweaty, like fight or flight kicks in. Absolutely masterpiece scene, brilliantly written, probably one of the best, one of the scariest, at least, scenes in any Stephen King book. The only scene that, in my opinion, really is in the same league is the scene in The Shining when Danny goes into the room and confronts the woman in the bathtub. So the scene with Larry in the Lincoln Tunnel, absolute tour de force masterpiece, and one of the great overall highlights of The Stand. So as always, I like to point out the Easter eggs that I found, and one of the things that you notice when you read or listen to Stephen King over and over and over again is that he keeps coming back to the same tropes. And one of the classic Stephen King tropes is kind of a rugged masculine character dressed in a blue chambray work shirt with broken down work boots. And that trope is alive and well in The Stand. I tried to figure out if The Stand is actually the birthplace of that stereotype, that Stephen King stereotype, and I'm not 100% sure on that. It may be, but anyway, blue chambray work shirts and broken down work boots are alive and well in The Stand. Franny mentions attending a poetry reading by the poet Ted Ensslin, who was actually a real-life poet who lived in Maine, and interestingly, Ensslin is also the last name of the author main character from the story 1408. So maybe that Ensslin is the son of Ted Ensslin, or a distant relative, or it could have just been a coincidence. But little things like that, I really enjoy. So of course, Stovington, Vermont, which is the location of the plague center where Stu is initially held as a patient and then kind of as a prisoner. Stovington is the town that had the preparatory academy, Stovington Preparatory Academy, where Jack Torrance from The Shining initially taught at and was later fired from, which prompted him to search for his job and ultimately landed him the caretaker position in the Overlook. So Stovington comes up multiple times in the early years of Stephen King, and it shows up again in The Stand. And while it wasn't ultimately known, probably even to Stephen King, when he initially wrote The Stand, Randall Flagg is explicitly later identified to be the same character as Martin, Walter, the Man in Black from the Dark Tower series. Walter also is the main antagonist in The Eyes of the Dragon. And one of the dead giveaways, one of the tells, is that Flagg often uses names that have the initials RF. For instance, Richard Fry, Robert Frank, Ramsey Forrest, Richard Fannin, etc. That is one of the classic tells and the dead giveaways about Flagg. And finally, Fran is mentioned as reading 4 chapters of a paperback Western novel written by that woman up in Haven. And Haven is the setting of the Tommyknockers. And the main character of the Tommyknockers is a woman author who writes Western paperbacks. So I thought that was a nice connection. It's also extra interesting because the Tommyknockers had not been written when Stephen King initially wrote The Stand. So he took the opportunity of revisiting The Stand and revising it and updating it for the complete and uncut edition to throw in that additional new Easter egg to the Tommyknockers that wouldn't have existed when he initially wrote the novel. So at the end of book 1 of The Stand, I mean, obviously it's impactful, because for the past 2 weeks, every time I've coughed or sneezed, I've been like, oh no, oh my God. And that's the sign of a book that, while potentially not like screaming out in your face, kind of scary, it's obviously gotten under my skin. Because now when anytime I sneeze or cough or hear someone else, I think, Captain Trips. The feeling as Campion, the soldier at the beginning, flees the base with his family, especially on a reread, knowing everything that comes next, is almost overwhelming. It's literally ground zero, like the pinpoint of the destruction of pretty much the entire population of Earth, all because of the decision of one man. And that one man and his decision lingers, haunts the entire first book of The Stand, as well it should. In an odd way, reading the first book of The Stand reminded me a lot of watching Titanic. So Campion leaving the base, or the virus getting out, and then Campion leaving the base is like Titanic hitting the iceberg. And slowly, insidiously, the world order starts sinking. Like what happens at Titanic, people don't realize how dangerous it is until it's too late. And focusing on individual characters brings a very relatable kind of personal touch to the massive tragedy, which is like what James Cameron did with Jack and Rose in Titanic. It's an intimate scope with an epic scale. Intimate to make you care about the humanity of the situation, and epic to pull back and show the flashes of the madness and destruction going on in the larger world. The Stand, I think, the heart of its lasting power and impact is the vivid characterizations. I mean, some of the best, most well fleshed out, well rounded, rightfully so, considering the book is so dang long and we get to spend so much time with these characters, but still some of the most vivid and well fleshed out characters in the entire Stephen King universe. On the reread, it's like reacquainting yourself with old friends. Friends that I hadn't visited for years and years. And it was like, yep, here we are. You know, we just pick up after years without missing a beat, because those characters are so vivid and you care so much about them that they get lodged in your memory. And I think that is the true beating heart and the lasting value of The Stand. So the pacing is obviously not the same as in the truncated 1978 edition, which in comparison feels like a runaway train just like barreling forward. The complete and uncut moves at a much more leisurely pace, but there are several dozen chapters just in the first book alone, and each chapter jumps from character line to character line, and then we'll step back periodically to just do some random big picture kind of vignettes, and overall it keeps things moving forward pretty well. And one of the most interesting things about The Stand is its really checkered and strange publication history. And rather than go into all of that here, I've gone into that at length in another video, which I will link in the description to this video. I think your preferred version may strongly depend on which version you experienced first. So I know plenty of people who read the 1978 cut first and found the 1990 almost like overly full of bloat. They get really frustrated with it because they were like, come on, like keep going, move on. And then people like me who initially read the complete and uncut, to read the 1978 version is like a Reader's Digest condensed version of one of the great novels of the 20th century. Like, why wouldn't you want all that extra content and all that extra world building and context and information? So in my opinion, and I know not everyone will feel like this, but in my opinion, and also seemingly in Stephen King's opinion, because it's the version that has been published ever since it was initially released in 1990, the complete and uncut is my preferred version. I feel like it's the definitive version, and it renders the 1978 cut of The Stand basically just a historical footnote. It's an item of interest. And I know I'm not trying to be controversial, I'm just giving my opinion, because I know there are people who will live and die by the value of this over this. But like I said, I think a lot of it depends on which version you experienced first. So next steps, what comes next? So the world has pretty much been emptied out, and the few survivors are kind of drifting ultimately vaguely towards each other based on visions that they're all having in dreams. So in the next book of the book, the survivors will coalesce together and start the long and laborious process of trying to rebuild society. And then ultimately beyond that, the big showdown, the climactic battle between good and evil, but those will be saved for other videos. I'm curious, in the comments, do you view The Stand as overrated, or as like legitimately and deservedly so Stephen King's best, most famous work of all time? It's divisive and it's interesting. And part of me going into The Stand, you know, anytime I have this idea of like, you're supposed to love this thing, This thing is the best. Everybody says so, and you have to say so too. It makes me not want to feel that way. It makes me like out of the gate, like I don't like this. I don't want this. I don't have to feel any certain way. And I was conscious of that and trying to take that into account. My inherent, like, you don't tell me what to do. Don't tell me how to feel. I'll feel however I want about The Stand. And I was trying to keep a neutral stance and an open mind. And the best I can come up with is that it's a great book and it's epic, especially in its first section when the world literally like ends, but it's not perfect. But I'm curious to know what you think. And I'll ask this question again in the last video, but like, is the stand worth it in your opinion? And also, what is your preferred cut, the 1978 version or the complete and uncut? Let me know. I'm curious to know what you think. Thanks as always to channel sponsor Thomas over at skcollector.com. Thanks to channel member the Mr. N. Dean. And thanks to all of you for watching the videos, for subscribing to the channel, and for your ongoing support of me. It means the world to me. I really appreciate it. So wherever you are in the world, take care of yourselves, try not to catch Captain Trips, and I will talk to you later. Bye.